Let's jump into Women's Health 102, and we're going to talk a little bit about guys at the end too, because if we can understand guys just a bit, things might be a little bit smoother out there. So this is a bit of a continuation over last time. We are going to go through several topics here. So these are the pillars of health that we are going to do our blogs about, and we're going to cover a lot of them. And today, of course, we're in the hormonal section, and the hormonal section is really, it influences everything, doesn't it? And especially women will tell you that, the brain, neurological, it's absolutely huge. But you know, when a guy is very crabby, it's very hormonal also, and I'll talk about that. What makes a guy really crabby? Detoxification system, how we detoxify our hormones is absolutely critical. If our liver is not up and running like it should be, we're going to have some dominance of some very inflammatory hormones that could really affect breast health. It can affect brain health. It can affect fertility. So our detoxification pathways are really important. And even something that we don't even think about, gastrointestinal. If somebody comes in with hot flashes, the first thing I do is give them fiber. Why would I do that? Fiber feeds the good bacteria, and the bacteria is responsible for getting rid of about half of our excess estrogen. So therefore, fiber can get rid of hot flashes. See, all I'm doing is helping the gut get rid of estrogen. See, so everything is so connected. And to just dump in a hormone to try to capture excessive other hormones is just really quite ludicrous and shallow thinking. And you're bound to run your ship on rocks when you do that. So we're going to start out with precocious puberty. I don't know if you've noticed it, but especially with girls, you are seeing girls with very early sexual characteristics that should not be happening. We're talking age 7, 8, 9. That is the new definition. Precocious puberty used to be defined as age 12. Now they've lowered it to age 7 or 8 in girls. So something is happening out there that should not be happening. And we're seeing things that we just should not be seeing, and it's very worrisome. And it's worrisome for boys as well, because what is happening with them is they are maturing also at rates that they should not be, and at the same time fertility is decreasing immensely. Today's male is only about 30% as fertile as just 2 generations ago. So our fertility has gone down by 70%. Females, the jury is still out. The fertility rate has definitely decreased, but it's a little bit more controversial. But working in the trenches here at DBC, we can tell you that the amount of fertility work that we have to do is amazing, especially when I compare it to just 25 years ago when we first started. Some of the causes are exposure to compounds early on in utero. I don't have it listed, but it's something that has a profound influence, especially on girls. And these compounds can actually be stress compounds. If mom has had a very stressful pregnancy, it affects the adrenals and how it responds to stress in little girls. And then it starts producing hormones that it shouldn't early on in life. So a very stressful pregnancy can be a cause of precocious puberty. Being overweight as a toddler, especially if it's due to too many carbohydrates, which causes one of your hormones to rise rapidly, which is insulin. This can have a profound impact on your other hormones. Because remember, hormones are like a choir. They sing together. And insulin is another one of those hormones. And if it's artificially spiked by too many sugary drinks, too many French fries, we can have a profound effect. And speaking of French fries, a study came out just a bit ago that if you have 2 servings of French fries a week at age 5 and below, which is not uncommon, is it? There's a lot of these kids out there. Your chance of developing breast cancer by age 50 has doubled. So obviously what we do as a little kid has profound influence all the way on down the line. So yeah, and you know, I'm picking on French fries, but I'm sure there's other foods too, right? It's just French fries tend to be a little bit more tough as far as insulin production goes, actually, because insulin production, right? You get the diabetes that's associated with that. We now know that fried foods is the second leading cause of diabetes. Yeah, it's not just sugar anymore. It's fried foods also. So everything is tied together, and that's what drives us doctors a little bit batty sometimes in this kind of medicine, functional medicine, is everything's so connected, and you have aha moments almost every day when you do the research. Like, this, it's connected. Okay, and you get it because everything is connected. So environmental toxins is absolutely huge. Your phthalates, which is your hard plastics, and xenoestrogens, which is environmental estrogens. We are just swimming in a sea of estrogens in our environment, to the point that even up in the Arctic, the animals are changing. The polar bears are giving birth to little cubs that have characteristics of both male and female. Seals right now up in the North Pole are having a problem with reproduction. There's a huge decline because our estrogens that are found in our environment, even way up there, is affecting these animals in a huge way. So if it's starting to affect animals, you would think it would probably start affecting us as well. And I'd say this is a huge main cause of precocious puberty. Every time you have chicken soup from a can, that is the #1 BPA source, which is an estrogenic compound that's out there. The second leading source is ravioli. I don't know why, but that's a second leading cause. Third leading cause, cups like they use at Starbucks. Okay, you got that hot steam that goes up against that plastic lid, and then all that stuff drips down again. Huge source, it's a huge problem. And I can go on and on and on. Even sniffing glue, you know, I said that wrong, but the smell, the smell of glue. I remember when I insisted when our carpet was laid and when our wooden floor was laid that we used non-toxic glues. And it was really hard to find because I know the stuff is really toxic and estrogenic, and it's just not good for you. So we try to be as environmentally clean in our buildings, and it's not always easy. Radiation, which affects hormone levels tremendously, is another cause. And the central nervous system abnormalities. So we're talking tumors to the pituitary and such. There's another possible cause. So it is a crisis in waiting, and we're starting to see a lot of danger signs. I'm just wondering what this generation that's now 4 or 5 years old is going to look like in 30 years. I'm really wondering about it. And it's a healthcare crisis that is just looming on us, and it's important to be very aware of it. So we're going to then skipping. We're going to skip along to various topics, PMS being one of them, and then we're going to go into all kinds of different ones. And why are we doing that? Just because there's so many different labels out there, and we'd like to have at least give you an idea on what each one of those labels are, and we're going to throw the expertise of our DBC doctors at you. We'll address questions afterwards, so I think you're up first.
Great.
Go for it.
Sounds good, thank you.
Yep, this is Dr. Kate. Enjoy.
I'm going to talk about PMS. A couple reasons for PMS that we think it's really important to talk about here. There are a lot of misconceptions out there that a lot of the symptoms of PMS are normal or typical, or yeah, that's just part of having your period every month, right? You deal with the cramps, you deal with the mood swings, all of that kind of thing. It's not normal to have symptoms of PMS. It's not. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what can cause some of those symptoms, what makes them more severe than others, that kind of thing. So first of all, PMS, what is it? Technically, when we look at the definition of PMS, it's just the mood portion of having your period or of menstruation for women that goes kind of nutso. So it's the mood swings, it's the dysphoria, it's the depression, it's the anxiety, the up and down spikes that we're talking about technically with PMS. However, it does include a lot of other symptoms that are associated with it. So I lump it all together. There are over 300 symptoms of PMS, and we're going to talk about a lot of those. Okay, we'll get to that slide later. But when we look at PMS functionally, it's a wake-up call for us every month for women who are menstruating. This is, it's kind of like knocking on the door and saying, this is what your health looks like. hello, here I am, you can't ignore me. Okay, these are signs and symptoms something is not right. And then it goes away for the rest of your cycle, and it comes back and reminds you, yep, something's not right here, something's not right, and then it goes away. So learning to listen to those signs and symptoms is part of PMS. As we mentioned last week when we were talking about hormones, a lot of times people think about them as just this internal working clock that just kind of goes and does its own thing. It's just your own cycle, and maybe everyone's cycle is different. However, we forget that what we put in to the system profoundly affects that. So your hormones are responding to stimulus. They're responding to what input you're giving them, whether that's nutrition, lifestyle, stress, and we're going to talk about all those different inputs that might be affecting why some people experience more PMS type symptoms. So what can cause PMS? Well, the mechanism is actually quite poorly understood, and it's multifactorial. This is a word that I love, multifactorial, because it means lots of things cause it. Okay, it's a fancy way of saying it could be just about anything playing into this. It's a multifactorial cause, and most diseases really are multifactorial. And so when we look at PMS, we have to look at all the different parts of the web that feed into the symptom set that you end up with. I'm going to talk quite a bit about something called estrogen dominance. You may have heard this around DBC before, estrogen, this elusive concept of estrogen dominance. We're going to try to define it for you a little bit better. But it does lead to that imbalance of hormones that can cause more PMS type symptoms. Insulin resistance, Dr. Denbour mentioned this already. Eating a lot of high sugar, high carbohydrate foods can cause your body to not recognize insulin the way that it's supposed to. And when your body's not recognizing a hormone, it'll ramp itself up to say, hey, this isn't as functional as it should be before. With all of that insulin floating through your system, it's going to toss some of those other hormones off balance. So all of these things can play into it. Again, my favorite word, multifactorial. So we're going to talk about a few of those things. First, let's go over the menstrual cycle very briefly. This is a really nice figure because it talks about kind of all the different levels. Dr. Stacy has one later that she's going to run through with you. But we start out here on day 1 of a 28-day cycle. Okay, not everyone has a 28-day cycle, so it can be a little bit shorter or longer depending. It might vary. But where I want to focus is right here, okay, with our estrogen and our progesterone. So our two main hormones that we talk about when we talk about female health or women's health. Our lovely FSH and LH, they get a little bit ignored to the side. They're more complicated, so I'm not going to bore you with details about them. We'll just kind of mention it as we go through. So day 1, we start here. Okay, our follicle is developing. It's called the follicular phase, and estrogen is higher than progesterone. So while we are, this is at the end of menstruation, okay, while we are preparing to ovulate, we're coming through, estrogen is going to gradually raise and raise and raise until it hits ovulation where it's going to spike. That's when the egg is released from the follicle, okay? So you see estrogen's very high at that point. There's a little line there that says ovulation. You can also see LH and FSH will spike. So we get a big spike during ovulation. And a lot of women will experience PMS symptoms at ovulation because of that estrogen spike. Okay? Especially if they are estrogen dominant, which we'll get back to. Let's say this is a standard, typical, normal cycle. So estrogen falls down, okay? If the egg is not fertilized, then what happens is, well, even if it is, progesterone will come up and it will be dominant in the cycle. See how it's beat out the estrogen there? The green gets higher than the yellow. We're seeing that, right? Mm-hmm. So there's our luteal phase, okay? So we see progesterone getting higher. And then if there is no fertilization of the egg, then that progesterone will fall back down. If the egg is fertilized and implants and a pregnancy happens, then progesterone has to stay high. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about how that's important later with fertility as well. If you can't get that progesterone high enough, then you're going to have problems as well maintaining pregnancy. So then what's supposed to happen is the progesterone drops a little quicker than the estrogen. You see that there, and then menstruation occurs. So all of the lovely lining that's been building up in the uterus will go away, and then you restart over on this side with estrogen dominant to progesterone. Questions on that? We got that, kind of the idea of that? Okay, so what are you saying, Dr. Kate? What does that matter? We'll get back to it in a second. PMS symptoms. So everyone's different, but we talk mostly about mood when we talk about PMS. However, sugar cravings, cramping, breast tenderness, insomnia, headaches, fatigue, la 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 la. Lots of different things that can happen with PMS. Some people are more severe than others, right? Some of those things are more prominent than others. You may have one or two things, or, you know, like I said before, women may experience more of these symptoms during ovulation. It kind of depends on a lot of different factors. But the one that we want to talk about here is estrogen dominance. So, what we're talking about is the relative ratio of estrogen to progesterone. I'll say that again. The relative ratio of estrogen to progesterone in your body constantly. Okay? There are normal fluctuations, right? So we have our estrogen supposed to be a little bit higher for a little while, then the progesterone takes over, and then the estrogen comes back over and takes over. What we're talking about with estrogen dominance is estrogen is all the time relatively higher than progesterone. There's a lot of reasons why that can happen, which is the next slide. But when we have that happen, you can see how our cycle is going to get a little bit messed up, right? When progesterone is supposed to be high, it can't be because there's so much estrogen relative to progesterone. Interestingly, doesn't matter how much overall progesterone level is. It's all about the ratio. So one person may have get their estrogen measured at a random time during the month. Number one, you can see why that would not be helpful unless they know where they are in their cycle exactly, which most women don't. So if they were here, their estrogen is going to look entirely different than if they were on day 21. So if you get labs drawn and you have a total estrogen level that you're looking at, it's not going to be super helpful. You need to know what the estrogen levels are relative to progesterone. Okay, so why it says overall more important than total estrogen levels is that ratio. Again, for fertility, I mentioned that earlier, if you have estrogen dominance throughout your whole cycle, your progesterone's, even if you get a fertilization, it's never going to stay high enough for you to maintain a pregnancy, which is why a lot of women with estrogen dominance do struggle with miscarriages or becoming pregnant because they can never get that progesterone to be up there high enough. A very common practice in medicine now is to give progesterone injections when a woman has had multiple miscarriages to try to fix this problem. However, they're just adding, right, they're not bringing the estrogen down at that point. They're just trying to artificially raise the progesterone for a little while. And not to say it's completely ineffective, because sometimes it works, but from our functional perspective, as soon as those progesterone injections stop, it's not like your body learns, oh yeah, I should have more progesterone. It's just going to crash back down and you're going to end up with the same estrogen dominant symptoms. So that's estrogen dominance, the idea of that. Do you see why that can cause some of these symptoms, why it can be a big problem with women, not just for fertility, but for PMS? Because of that relative ratio of estrogen to progesterone is not balanced. So what can cause this? Where does it come from? Why does somebody become estrogen dominant? Well, estrogen's produced in the ovaries naturally. That's the good kind. We like that. However, estrogen is also produced in fat cells. So our fat cells become little hormone factories. And if you get too much fat, then that starts to override your ovaries' ability to produce. Or, you know, that normal cyclical change is not going to happen because your fat is just producing, kind of at random, some of these hormones. I have apple shape versus pear shape on there. Some of you may have heard this before. People with a more hormonal pattern to their fat shape, women especially, are going to have more of a pear shape. Apple shape tends to be a little bit more metabolic syndrome, so having to do with sugars and insulin. Also harder on your heart to have that apple shape. But when we look at, that's one of the things that we can use sometimes is to say, okay, what does your shape look like? Does it look more like a hormonal type of a person, or does it look more insulin resistance? And that helps us determine which pathway we take. So we got it produced in the ovaries and the fat cells, and then we've got the environmental estrogen soup that we swim in, right? So we've got BPA, which is our bisphenol A found in plastics. We talk a lot about this with kids too, because we use a lot of plastics with kids, right? So that's one of the exogenous estrogens that Dr. Denbour was talking about. Premarin is a hormone replacement therapy, and that does get excreted through the body if it's not used up, and so that ends up in our watershed along with birth control. So in our soil and in our water, it can't be filtered out by sand, so it will end up back into our water supply, and that's a lot of where we get some of this from. Also, that water supply does translate in then to the animals and the foods that we eat, because that kind of all gets fed back through this cycle. Synthetic hormones as well, again, the Premarin usually is the one we're talking about there, but some estradiols and those kind of things that people will use to try to fix hormonal problems instead of getting to the root of some of those kind of things. So those are some of the more major environmental, and again, he's got a picture there of the Starbucks coffee cup as being one of the more common. I know, and a lot of people are going, oh, don't look at me. But it is. Bring your own mug. It's really quite that simple. Okay, so what about adrenals? We mentioned this in our last seminar a little bit, something that I get kind of excited about talking about, because we forget sometimes about adrenals when we're talking about hormones. And here's our normal stress response chart. I love charts. You may notice that. So what happens when we are stressed, whether that's a chronic long-term emotional stress or you're running away from a bear in the woods, your body does not know the difference between those two. Okay, they have the same stress, the same response hormonally, physically, to emotional stress and to physical stress. So this alarm happens, the bear's chasing me. I have a burst of cortisol and DHEA. So cortisol is our stress hormone. Okay, it's the inflammatory hormone that we worry about sometimes, and I'll tell you why in a second. Now, normally, you run away from the bear, you escape and slam the door behind you, whew, I'm safe. Your body goes back down, the hormone cortisol comes back down and returns to its normal level. Okay, not a stressed state. While a lot of us are in chronic stress states. We have stressful jobs, we have a lot on our plate, we've got families to care for, okay? Especially women tend to end up in this very chronic stressed anxiety state where you start to see some symptoms of this cortisol remaining high. So you see that red, it's supposed to be below this line, but it stays high for a long period of time. After a while, you move to exhaustion where the cortisol cannot keep up, and that's where we talk about adrenal fatigue here, if anybody has heard of that term before, adrenal fatigue as being something that is a stress response after a long period of stress. I had some pretty significant adrenal fatigue after I graduated from chiropractic school. Stressful period in my life. And that lasts and it lingers. And if you don't take care of it, then different things can happen. So one of the things that can happen is cortisol will steal ingredients for your sex hormones, for your estrogen and your progesterone. There's only so many ingredients in your body. Your body has to prioritize. And if your body is so busy making cortisol all the time, a lot of times it won't make the correct amount of estrogen and progesterone. So that can feed into this cycle as well. Also, if you have a lot of xenoestrogens, so that's the estrogens coming from our environment, they will overload the liver. So the liver's working really, really hard, the adrenals are working overtime, and you can't clear the estrogens that you're getting from your environment, which is a huge part of getting rid of those things. So the liver is busy metabolizing all of your stress hormones, all of that cortisol. It leaves the estrogens just hanging around in your system, and that's where we get into trouble, because those estrogens will transform into quinones, which are carcinogenic. So that's where, when we have the estrogen dominance, not only do we have this monthly wake-up call saying, hey, something's not right, I have PMS symptoms. Your body is saying, I've got all these estrogens and they're gonna just sit there and turn into carcinogens if we're not careful. We gotta do something. We gotta get our liver working. We gotta get these out of here. Okay, so that's part of the wake-up call because of the long-term effects of these kind of things. So what do we do functionally? Okay, so obvious answer would be to avoid taking in more estrogen than you have to. Okay, let your body make enough estrogen for you. Avoid those exogenous estrogens. Reduce your stress to reduce your cortisol. We talked about how that was important, right? Don't let this long-term stress. Find good coping mechanisms to reduce your cortisol. That's a good thing to ask your DBC doctor or your health coach, or a lot of different methods for doing that, for reducing cortisol levels. Nutrition. We try to encourage your body to get rid of the extra estrogen, so to metabolize it. Feed the liver, right? Broccoli is a good one. Just an example of one of the things that can feed your liver and help get rid of some of those excess estrogens and other toxins that might be hanging out in your body. Utilize phytoestrogens if you are having imbalances. Okay, they are a weaker estrogen that hits a different receptor. It hits the beta, not the alpha receptor, and so it's a little bit gentler. It's a gentler hormone that doesn't have a lot of these same dominating effects. And in case you're having some problems with maintaining good levels of estrogen, which some people do, especially around menopause. So using a phytoestrogen instead can help with that. There are a couple supplements I want to talk about. First one is called chasteberry. This is one that helps raise progesterone. Okay, it's an adaptogen, so if you are estrogen dominant, it can help you level that out. Okay, it can help you raise relatively the progesterone. It's not the same as getting a progesterone shot, because if you're not estrogen dominant, chasteberry is not going to do anything. Okay, it's going to actually help lower the other direction. That's what adaptogens are really good at. If it's too high, they lower it. If it's too low, they raise it. That's why we love to use adaptogens. They're very, very safe. Okay, so chasteberry is one that we use with a lot of our patients who have severe PMS symptoms. Femme premenstrual is a traditional Chinese herb, and I have a soft spot in my heart for traditional Chinese herbs. Having studied in China for a little while and seeing kind of the culture that surrounds that and all of the history and the tradition of these herbs and how long they've been used is really, really cool. This is more of our acute care one, so you wouldn't necessarily, if you had PMS, take this all the time throughout your cycle. You would just maybe use it starting at ovulation or whenever you notice symptoms come on for you. It's really great for heavy bleeding, mood swings. It can decrease that mood part, the depression or anxiety. And it's also really good at modulating sugar cravings. That's one thing that a lot of women will experience during PMS, and it's actually feeding the flame, right? We don't want to add more sugar when we're already having this problem. So in this case, femme premenstrual is really good at modulating those kind of things and the sugars. So really, when you think about PMS or a lot of these hormone issues, we're going to talk about estrogen dominance, which hopefully you have a better grasp of, right? We kind of understand what that has to do with our cycles. And it's about modulating the ratio, not so much about adding or subtracting hormones willy-nilly. It's more about trying to figure out, okay, where do we need to raise and lower, and how do we do that within the body, removing some of those exogenous estrogens and supporting progesterone production. If you have questions about this, you can ask them later. I know it's an interesting topic, but I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stacy at this point, and she's going to keep going. Thanks.
Well, Dr. Kate did a great job of summing up quite a bit of what really the hormone cycles are. A lot of people will, or women just in general, we like to characterize our bad days by a PMS day. So that really does kind of sum it up, because some days it truly is a PMS day, other days we just use it as more of a reason to be crabby. It's okay. So when I chose, I get to talk a little bit more about other forms of hormonal imbalances, mainly dysmenorrhea and polycystic ovary syndrome, which both of those tend to be under-discussed with doctors. But I thought, as with every discussion, which Dr. Kate did a wonderful job of discussing how the estrogen and progesterone fall, of really what's important when people are looking at fertility, because all of these things can create infertility issues over time, especially having the xenoestrogens added in there. This is where the BPA, the extra things in plastics, can create problems. They're even concerned now that the BPA-free is outgassing more problematic xenoestrogens than what the BPA was doing. So in a way, it's better to try to move to everything being more glass, paper, ceramic, and doing those kind of things. I do have and Tina, I'm gonna see if I can maybe put this out for you to put onto Facebook for us. There is a link to, Oregon had put out in 2008, the safer plastics. It doesn't mean that they're safe.
We already got it.
You already got it? Okay, so if you could just remind everybody where it's at on Facebook tomorrow, that'd be awesome. But basically what we're looking at is different plastics are known to be safer. Does that mean that they're 100% safe? No. Unfortunately, with all of the chemicals that we have in plastic, we really don't understand what kind of toxicities they create to the body. Only a few of them have been studied, which are the ones that have been taken out of the children's bottles, the BPA, the phthalates. The reason those were taken out is we found out they created a lot of problems. Well, unfortunately, I'm sure there's other things that now we have the BPA-free options. Are they creating issues as well? And unfortunately, we're not going to see that for 10 to 15 years, again, because it's going to take us that long to catch up with our research more in general. So what I chose to talk about a little bit tonight is start out with more how to measure fertility, because I get this a lot in the office, because I have a lot of women who come in who really are truly not ovulating. So they're having a hard time deciding, well, how am I ovulating? Because I have symptoms throughout most of my cycle. I'll have about the week before, I have cramping, or I have breakthrough bleeding, I have headaches, whatever it may be. They're just not sure on how it goes. So a lot of people will do the basal body temps, which work very nicely. And this is, of course, if the thyroid is working well for you. If your thyroid is not keeping up with you, it's hard to tell whether or not you're ovulating because the thyroid is not giving you a spike. It's really under production. So that's where the basal body temps come in. There's also another wonderful one which I use a lot with patients. It's actually an ovulation method, but you can use the ovulation method for birth control as well, because if you know when you're ovulating, for those, you just have protected intercourse during those times. Wonderful for a married couple, so then the woman doesn't have to be on birth control and really messing up her cycle or throwing herself into a tizzy fit at least once to twice a month. So these are just the way that they look. Underneath the microscope. Saliva, they say, is 90 to 95% accurate for ovulation time, so I like to give everybody that option through this. And basically looking at when are things fertile, and basically you're fertile when the fern leaves show up. And that's also the time when the estrogen and progesterone are starting to do their increase, which is nice, but the problem is a lot of times women don't get that true increase. With your birth control pills, originally they did more of like a time where it was more estrogen. They would raise the estrogen so high and then they'd slowly decrease the dose of estrogen. Now we've realized that unfortunately we can't only give a woman estrogen within her birth control pills, so that we have other forms of progestins in there, which are of course your synthetic maids, which help to regulate some of those mood swings a little bit better, but still all synthetic that you're adding into there. And the question with all the xenohormones, are we creating infertility by using birth control and consistency with women? Because a lot of teenagers I see, they'll start that for acne decrease or just heavy periods. Well, okay, that does help to cover up the symptoms, but have we fixed the problem? That's always the question. So what I put up here, I love these pathways, and when I go to explain to one of my female patients really what's going on in your body, I like to pull out this sterogenic pathways, because it's not as simple as Dr. Kate had said. You know, they're commonly using injections of progesterone to try to build up that progesterone amount to try to deal with the estrogen dominance. Well, the problem is you can't just drop something in and expect it not to have a cascaded event anywhere else. If you notice, progesterone is actually right up here, following right through there. Look at all of the places progesterone can go from there. It can go all the way over to making testosterone. It can make estrogens, E1, E2, and E3. It can also go down and make cortisol. So say somebody is already running on adrenal fatigue and you give them progesterone, basically what it's going to do is what they call a cortisol steal, drop right into cortisol. You're not actually helping the woman out except causing more stress to her body. So that it's not so simple as just dropping one thing in and saying, yep, we've got it fixed. This is why in the functional medicine web, we look at dealing with more than one pathway. That's why the foods become even more important. Studies have shown if a woman alters her diet, even from day 14 from ovulation to the time that she menstruates, she can change her check-in time. So you can change your symptoms. alone by doing that. It's very interesting as we look through this. So tonight I'm going to cover a little bit more with the polycystic ovary syndrome. They say this only affects anywhere between 4 to 12% of women of reproductive age. I think this is really low. I think we have a lot of women now who are undiagnosed because they're not showing up with the more ultrasound cysts showing up within the body. I see this a lot because I deal with all of these causes and symptoms every day. I see this with every patient that I work with that has some hormonal deficiency. Are they polycystic ovary? Maybe not yet. Could they be? Possibly. So if women, a lot of times if you go on birth control, what's the first thing that women complain about? There you go. Why is that? You're adding estrogens into a system that's stressing out a liver that may not already be working. You're depleting B12 and folic acid by taking that birth control, which upregulates your liver cycle to help take these estrogens out of the body. So we're depleting them with the birth control. So what's going to happen? We're going to gain weight by putting all those estrogens in our fat. So when we go to break down that fat later, what do we release again? The same estrogens we just put into our body, but now it's more of a chemical soup going on. So these are all things that can lead to problems. With polycystic ovary syndrome, one of the things, it's one of the most common things that causes infertility. These women usually do not have an ovulation because their body is so out of whack with their hormones. Typically this tends to be more of a, not an estrogen dominant system, it's more of a testosterone dominant system where it's more of the DHT, which is your inflammatory testosterone. These women traditionally, as it gets more into its advanced stage, you'll see the acne pattern will hit more of the chin, where our hair pattern would be if you were a gentleman. I even have some women who will actually start putting up entire facial hair in that area, and that's truly the definition of a polycystic ovary female. She'll have trouble losing weight. She'll have a lot of the cascades of symptoms where she'll have a lot of carb cravings and sugar cravings. Fatigue usually hits. She'll hit a depression through there as well. Many times the one cycle will be light bleeding, the next one will be really heavy, uncomfortable bleeding. So this for women becomes a real big problem. It's not a simple answer. You can't just all of a sudden say, oh, you know what we're going to do? We're going to give you a little bit more estrogen. We'll stop this process. And that's the traditional way to treat this, is give them more birth control. More estrogen will drive this away. Well, but if you drop the estrogen in, then only you're going to drive back to the DHT pattern in the long run. For a short while, it will change things. It will. But it's not going to fix it. A lot of women will also show up with a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in there, and that's because their body, their insulin receptors are damaged, and it's primarily happening within the uterus. So if we can change how the uterus reacts to sugar, you can change how the woman is holding her weight, you can change how she's dealing with her moods, and you can change how the liver is functioning. So this one really responds nicely to doing dietary changes. One of the supplements that we typically use to start out with this one is called Senatol. And our Senatol is a myo-inositol. It has some citric acid and magnesium in it. Originally was more studied for calming the neurotransmitters in the brain. Helps with serotonin and GABA, so the calm, relaxing effect. But the wonderful thing that they found through studies with myo-inositol is it helps resensitize the insulin receptors within the uterus specifically. So typically about a month after I start a female on this, I can start to see changes within her acne pattern, within her symptomatology, and she's already noticing how she's feeling and, hey, you know, I didn't get as moody this month, or, you know, I didn't have those strong cravings for chocolate, and then of course I had to have tortilla chips right after. So those simple carb cravings go away for her. And with most women, when we are working with them, typically it's a 3 to 6 month time before you're actually going to see how the hormones are truly laying out. With birth control, of course, you see that within the first month. Well, that's a very strong estrogen that you're using. With what we're doing, we're working with the body's natural ability to cut down on those xenoestrogens, what the body's making in its own fat, in its own ovaries, and using it to work the way that it needs to. Now, this is what polycystic ovaries actually look like when you go in and get an ultrasound. So if you see all these little dark circles, that's the ovary on the inside, and those dark circles are the cysts all the way around that entire ovary. So it looks worse when you look up to it, but it's very small. Like the normal ovary on the top over there, you see there's no cysts or those holes all the way around. Basically, these cysts love to fill up with blood as well. So if a cyst pops, it's very painful. Very, very painful. So women struggle with these. I mean, when that pops, it's probably one of the most excruciating pain that women will say. It's kind of like having a kidney infection. They don't say it's as bad as childbirth, but I've never had a child, so I can't say any of the above. So, nor do I have polycystic ovary, thankfully. Now, dysmenorrhea. Let's move on to another one that can create problems with women, not always an infertility issue, but this is what they call the painful cycle. So dysmenorrhea, basically when women have cramping, what's happening is their uterus is actually contracting to slough off all of that extra buildup that it's tried to do to create a safe environment if an egg were to be fertilized. So that's why the progesterone comes up in your cycle, is that's creating an increase in your uterine lining so that when the egg implants, it has a safe place to stay. If that progesterone is not high enough and you don't get enough within there, the egg does not plant, or if it does, it releases very quickly, and that's where we have the miscarriage. Okay, so typically it's not uncommon in a normal, what I would consider a normal cycle, to have some sort of cramping the first day or so. But it's usually a 2 out of a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst pain that they've ever had in their life. And it traditionally only lasts for a couple hours. It may come and go cyclically, but it's not one of those things that's debilitating. Dysmenorrhea, these contractions are debilitating. You're not going to do anything for the first day, sometimes the second day. This is what I struggled with a child. My mom would find me laying backwards over my bed and my head on the ground, and she came in, she looked at me, she goes, "You okay?" I go, "I don't know what's happening, but I can't move. This feels good." So at that point, I was diagnosed with this, and of course, at that age, we took the birth control route, and now knowing what I have possibly done to myself, you always question, am I always going to be depleted in B12? Is that what created my digestive issues? Folic acid, I always have a struggle with the liver. I struggle with strong scents. They make me sick, give me headaches. Is that what started it, or was I always this way? I think it added to some of it, but this is a problem. This is actually in 80% of your adolescence girls. They did a study on over 900 girls in high school and low college, so 15 to 21. And what they found is that 79.6% of them, so about 80%, struggled with some sort of painful cycle. And it didn't have to be monthly. It usually was every other month for most of them. So that's a pretty large amount. For me, I don't like to see that. I would prefer all of my young ladies that walk into my office saying, you know, I just mark it on the calendar and I know I'm going to start. And then basically, life is pretty good. I know that the day before I may have a little back tension, but everything's great. I don't get the breast tenderness. I don't get the swelling. I don't get bloated. I don't have mood swings. My husband doesn't look at me and go, "It's that time of month, isn't it? I'm out. See you later. See you in a couple days." So that's really what we're looking for. A lot of these women will also have a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms. They'll get diarrhea or constipation with their cycle. That's not normal either. We're not looking for those type of changes, because if your uterus is really affecting your colon and creating problems, we're going to struggle with depression or anxiety. Those things tend to come up. Or on top of that, then it creates more food sensitivities to pop up. If you're sensitive to food and you eat it during those times, hello, World War II just started, okay? Elimination symptoms, this is where the constipation, diarrhea comes in. Physical symptoms, there is a lot of this. I see this a ton with my young ladies, and the first thing I think of is questioning whether or not we're having an anemia situation, because a lot of these women also will have heavy bleeding cycles. And whenever a woman loses too much blood, what's the first thing you think of when we have blood loss? Iron. And many of the girls that I work with struggle with iron deficiency. So we're dealing with anemia, and typically it's only when they're cycling. So when I have blood drawn, I want it on day 2 of the cycle. I want to know the second day that you're bleeding, I want to know where your anemia levels are, because if it's truly low only one time of the month, it'll only consistently get worse as time goes on. And these women struggle a lot with depression and irritability. These are all things that can be worked with. over time. This is where we always talk about, we want to get the BPA out of there. If I see them walk in consistently with a cup from Big B or Starbucks, that's the first thing I'm going to hit on. The next thing I'm going to hit on is my artificial sweeteners. I don't want those in the diet. That's really not good for you, because what are you creating? You're creating insulin resistance down the way, which then could lead to diabetes or even more fertility issues. I want them to do a lot of good vegetables, and this is where my health coaches come in. This is why I send patients to health coaches, because there's not enough time to say, okay, let's sit down and review your entire diet. I want a 1-week food journal. I want to pick it apart, because there's things in here that you're doing that I know they're setting you off. A lot of my women, I also have a mark on the calendar. What symptoms do I get on the calendar? So then I can see what days it's showing up. Because instead of having to do a salivary test, which is what we would traditionally do to see on a cycling female where her estrogen and progesterone lies, that'll give me a good idea of what symptoms are showing up, so we can have a good idea of where do we need to start. Typically, we'll start with digestion, and then with liver, and then deal with adrenals and thyroid, because those are all the organs that are more master symptoms on top of those hormones. But you still have to deal with the also fact that we are very unhappy during certain times of the month. So we want to work with that. Okay, questions? I know that I did a lot there, so we'll take some afterwards, but hopefully you can absorb some of this. It's not the easiest thing in the world when we're dealing with female hormones. I always hate to say that, but you know, we as women, and most men can say, we're pretty difficult. And that's okay. We're very complex human beings, and I think this is probably one of the most blessings that you can ever have as a female, is actually to have this monthly check-in, because it gives you a good idea of what you are doing right and what you can do to improve on. Okay? I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Denbour to do a little bit of a bone talk with you.
Do we need a break? Tour de force of some research there. I so appreciate that, and now you know why I'm so proud of our doctors here. The information that's given is it's absolutely cutting edge, and I'm so proud of it, because you can see with the complexities of hormones, how just hijacking a hormone and dumping in estrogen and progesterone, or heaven forbid testosterone, it can have profound negative effects. You don't know where it's going to go. And this is why we try to work with the body instead of against the body. We're going to totally switch gears just for a moment. Maybe I'll give your aching brains a slight break here. But we're going to talk about bone density. Bone density is a huge topic. I think that it has, now this is my opinion and not research, I think it will be classified as an autoimmune disease at some point. That osteoporosis will be an autoimmune disease. Why? Because it originates in the gut, it's inflammatory, and it is usually associated with some other inflammatory disorder. It has all the hallmarks of and it responds to, all the normal things that we use for autoimmune disease. For example, vitamin D. If you have a patient who comes in with Crohn's disease, MS, Parkinson's, diabetes, vitamin D is the #1 thing you check, because we know deficiency in vitamin D greatly contributes to autoimmune disease. And we all know that vitamin D and bone health makes a lot of sense. But let's dig into this bone mineral density. It's extremely complicated, but I promise you I'm going to try to make it simple. But what really summed it up best was this little factoid. It was in USA Today, and I saw it on the front page just last summer. Your bone building drugs do not work. It was headline news. It basically said that these bone building drugs that are out there increases fracture risk after 1 year of use instead of decreasing. They build bone density, but they do not build bone strength. In other words, your bone becomes more chalk-like. Couple that with the profound amount of side effects, gastrointestinal mainly, and you are stuck with a therapy that is extremely negative and we don't recommend. And what the latest data is also showing is that bone density is not at all a good marker for bone strength. Now, this is very, very important to note, because I have had a lot of males and females come in that are supposedly deep into osteoporosis territory, and they come in with a fall that is just tremendous, that they should have broken bones and have not. I see this repeatedly. So that makes you think, okay, we really don't know what we're doing yet when it comes to bone loss. And if vitamin D and calcium supplementation and exercise was the answer, then we wouldn't have osteoporosis out there, would we? There's some missing elements out there. Now that's not to diminish the vitamin D. It's not to diminish the calcium supplementation or exercise, but what are the missing elements? So we're going to dig into that just a little bit. Bone density and bone quality aren't interchangeable. Bone density equals hardness, so that's the chalk-like effect. The bone matrix quality equals strength. And when you look at a healthy bone, it looks a little bit like a sponge. The way God made it is all these little spongy interconnecting, almost cells-like things, a little bit like a beehive. Very, very powerful. When you go into osteoporosis, you see that breakdown, not of the outer cortex, that hard chalk-like material, but of the interior. And why does that happen? With normal bone, we have bone formation with osteoblasts and bone breakdown of osteoclasts. And there's a nice balance going on. There's a continuous bone turnover. As we make new bone cells, we, through osteoclastic activity, that's a particular cell, we take out as much as comes in. And when we're younger, more comes in than we take out, so that's when we build. And as we age, there's a little bit of reversal of that. We get totally new bones every 7 years. There's a complete turnover of bone every 7 years, even when we're elderly. So after 50, the bone matrix declines before bone density, leaving bone weak and fracture prone. Why? Estrogen is a key sex hormone governing bone homeostasis. And estrogen is very much affecting something called the rank and rankle system. Now what is that? These are just receptor sites on your osteoclasts and osteoblasts. So these are the bone cells that produce and take away bones, and they get signals from estrogen. And one other very important thing, T cells from your immune system. That's a type of blood cell, as well as a neurotransmitter called serotonin. Where do we find most of our serotonin? In the brain? No. 90% of it is actually in the gut. Which, by the way, most mood disorders are actually gut disorders. Okay? So all of a sudden this becomes a really complicated picture, isn't it? Just piling in just calcium isn't going to do it anymore. So taking care of our immune system via our gut, because the gut is part of our immune system, all of a sudden we're improving the pathway to our osteoclasts and osteoblasts. I'll go over it one more time in the more normal language. If you decrease inflammation in the gut, if we have a healthy gut, you're normalizing the signal to bone production. And all that fancy word, osteoclast and rankle and who knows what all, they call it, kind of fall away. That's all you really need to know. Healthy gut equals less inflammation equals good signals to my bone. Combine that with the proper, and here's the whole thing summed up, but you know, I think you've had enough for tonight. You can study that on YouTube. What we really want to take home from all this is that, one, the vitamin D has to be adequate because that takes care of the gut. Number two, you do need the building block for your calcium. And now it gets kind of into controversial territory. There's calcium carbonate and citrate and oxalate and apatite. Where does what really should I be supplementing with? And the thick and thin of it is calcium hydroxyapatite, or calapatite for short. That's the trade name. And the reason that we've chosen that one is because it is the only one that research has shown doesn't just stop bone loss or slow it down, it can actually reverse it. This notion when the claim was made, was actually taken up by the FDA and went all the way up to the Supreme Court of California, who finally ruled in favor of the research company that yes, we can now claim Cal-Apetite reverses bone loss, and is the only one to do so. The other kinds of calciums, like calcium carbonate and oxalate, may even worsen osteoporosis and may worsen bone loss simply because it's rock-like, it's unabsorbable, it's the wrong kind of calcium, and it may affect gut function negatively. As far as we know, the cheaper calcium carbonates and oxalates are good only if you're very young. You might be able to absorb it at that point. Might be. This is why there's so much controversy out there, and I wish that research was just used for all these things. Cal-Apetite is the one that we use. So, how about exercise? Yes. The vitamin D? Yes. Vitamin K? Yes. Decreasing inflammatory foods? Yes. Would going gluten-free help? Yes. How about dairy-free? Absolutely. Osteoporosis is only found in dairy-consuming countries. Isn't that interesting? Maybe the American Dairy Association has pulled the wool over our eyes all this time. Because is milk rich in calcium? Yes, it is. Is it the kind of calcium we can build bones with? No. Where would we get our calcium then? From food? Veggies. Veggies is the one. Lots of colors. Our rainbow diet. Look under resources. I hope that explains some of our hormonal issues at hand. This was maybe a little bit of an intense seminar. I hope it was doable. The next topic is the truth about weight loss. This is functional medicine applied to weight loss. And it's not about the calories at all. It's about how our lifestyle needs to be reset in order to achieve weight loss. And as one final note of conclusion, as I was kind of philosophizing about hormones, that, you know, what's really gone wrong? Because in my short lifetime, I've seen some profound changes already. I think the last century stole our hormonal health. I really feel strongly about that. I was just thinking about, as one of our doctors was mentioning, plastics. I still remember as a kid and being kind of impacted by it for this, you know how these little moments come out, how I saw the very first advertisement for a real plastic purse. This was an advertisement from 1946, and I was for some reason studying plastics, probably for some school project, and I found this picture of this real plastic purse, and I remember being hit by that. Wow, that was really special back then. Now it's everywhere. It is, and look where it has gotten us. From 1946 to here. That real plastic purse has profoundly affected how our hormones operate. Add to that the increase in stress. How little time we truly take time to sit around the fire, right, even the males, and really talk as females amongst each other. How little we share our problems. How we expose ourselves to man-made foods like there's no tomorrow. It's one giant experiment. How we're exposed to pharmaceuticals. We are 3% of the world population in the United States, and yet we consume more than 70% of the world's pharmaceuticals. It is absolutely shocking how pills are being popped in this country. It is Tylenol, ibuprofen, popped like candy. The amount of chemicals that are in our food system, the food colors, the genetically modified foods, all that, our hormones have been stolen by the last century. And it's time to reclaim them. And the way to do that is through lifestyle changes, the proper nutraceuticals, and also, yes, time. This is an extremely important topic, and I hope you can tell that we're somewhat passionate about this. Because hormones drive us. It drives health in many ways, and there's a couple of really profound things that drive our health. One is gut health, the other one is hormones, neurological health, the nervous system. Of course, everything is important, but those are some really main drivers in today's society that we love to address. So, thanks for coming, and you're available one-on-one if you need us afterwards. All right, thanks.